The Valdres Combat Academy existed in the hollow heart of a dead moon, carved out by 3 generations of coalition engineers who had decided that the best place to train soldiers was somewhere that already looked like a war had happened. The tunnels were reinforced titanium ceramic composite. The gravity was adjustable by section. The air tasted faintly of recycled oxygen and institutional ambition, which was a specific and unpleasant flavor that Sarah Voss had become very familiar with over the past 14 months. She was eating alone again. This was not unusual. The Academy's mess hall seated approximately 4,000 cadets per rotation, organized by species cohort in a system that was officially called flexible social integration and was unofficially called everyone eats with their own kind, and humans eat near the ventilation unit. Sarah had a small table, a tray of food that the nutritional system had calibrated to human metabolic requirements, and a clear view of approximately 6,000 square feet of cadets, who ranged from mildly indifferent to openly dismissive of her existence. She preferred it that way. Invisibility had kept her alive more than once. Sarah Voss was 5'4", 128 pounds, and 27 years old. She had brown eyes, dark hair she kept pulled back in a regulation braid, and the kind of face that people consistently underestimated, which was something she had weaponized so thoroughly over the years that it had become less a feature and more a professional tool. Her official file listed her as a second-tier combat candidate. Moderate physical conditioning, standard human physiological limitations, recommended for intelligence or logistics track. Her unofficial history, the parts that certain organizations with no official names had very carefully kept out of any database the coalition could access, was considerably more interesting. She'd been recruited at 19 by people who recruited you, and they watched you survive something that should have killed you and got curious about the methodology. She'd spent 6 years doing work in places that didn't officially exist, learning from instructors whose names she'd never known and whose techniques predated every formal combat doctrine in the Coalition's library. She'd fought in 3 different conflict zones before humanity had even known that life existed beyond their solar system. She was, to put it plainly, not what her file said she was, but her file was exactly what she needed it to be. The Academy's combat assessment rotation was posted on the central display at 0600, and by 0615, the mess hall knew. Not because anyone made an announcement, the information spread the way information always spread in a closed population, through 1,000 small glances, whispered calculations, and the particular quality of silence that meant something worth watching was about to happen. Sarah finished her protein ration and read the assignment quietly. Combat assessment, physical evaluation. Cohort 7 Delta, Rodriguez T paired with Velks, Sunara paired with Das, Voss, Essa paired with Krath. She set down her fork with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who had just made a decision. Krath was Drevian. The Drevians had evolved on a world where the surface gravity registered at 3.8 standard, where the dominant predators had been creatures the size of small buildings, and where the primary evolutionary pressure on intelligent life had been, get stronger or get eaten. The Drevians had responded to this challenge by developing a biology that was less organic tissue and more structured mineral composite, a body that operated like stone wrapped in purpose. They were dense, powerful, and nearly impervious to conventional physical trauma. Their skeleton was a silicate iron lattice that could absorb impacts that would shatter durasteel plating. Their musculature generated force that the Academy's own equipment had to be specially calibrated to measure. Krath was the best of them. 8 feet 2 inches, 460 pounds. Undefeated in 17 months of training exercises. His ranking on the Academy's combat roster sat at 3rd overall, not 1st, because 2 of the instructors had refused to compete with him in live assessment on the grounds of self-preservation. And the ranking system required at least 5 evaluated matches for a top 2 placement. He was also, Sierra had observed from 14 months of careful watching, the worst kind of dangerous, the kind that had never been hurt, the kind that had won so consistently, so completely, that the concept of losing had never needed to become a real consideration. He fought like someone who had never once had to ask himself, what do I do if this doesn't work? Because it always worked. That was the crack. She'd found it the first week. She arrived. She just hadn't needed to use it yet. The combat assessment theater in Valdris was a different configuration than the standard sparring rings. It was a wide oval, 60 meters across, with observation tiers that rose steeply on all sides. The floor was impact-rated polymer over shock-absorbing substrate. Medical units were recessed into the walls. Force containment fields glowed faintly at the perimeter. The whole structure had been designed by someone who understood that the difference between training and dying was mostly a matter of which safeguards you'd remembered to activate. By the time Sierra entered, the observation tiers were approximately 60% full. More cadets than the assessment normally drew. Word had gotten around. She found her position marker on the floor and stood on it, hands loose at her sides, and looked across the oval at Krath. He was looking back at her, the way people sometimes looked at things they found beneath consideration, not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of bored, reflexive contempt that didn't require any actual thought. He'd probably glanced at her file. He knew the numbers. He had already finished the math. The instructor for this rotation was Commander HFY, a Cerulean, 4-limbed, narrow-faced, with the kind of professional detachment that suggested he had administered a great many assessments and found them uniformly adequate. He stood at the assessment podium with a data tablet and a posture that communicated he had other things to do afterward. Cohort 7 Delta. Combat assessment begins in 5 minutes. All pairs to marked positions. His voice was flat, procedural. Assessment criteria: sustained engagement, adaptive response, combat effectiveness under pressure. Pairs have been matched on evaluated combat potential scores. A sound ran through the observation tier. Not quite laughter, but adjacent to it. Krath's evaluated combat potential score was the highest in the cohort by a margin, so large it had briefly made the Academy's analytics division flag the data as a potential system error. Sierra's was 44th out of 51 in the cohort. The pairing was not an accident. HFY had made it himself, and he had done it with the particular calculation of someone who expected it to be educational, a demonstration of what happened when the Academy's standards met the Coalition's most recent charity admission. Krath walked to his position marker slowly, with the rolling, ground-covering stride of something that had never needed to move quietly. His stone composite structure caught the overhead lighting and gave him the look of a moving wall. Cadets in the lower observation rows leaned back. Reflexively as he passed, he stopped at his marker and turned to face Sierra, human. His voice was deep and resonant in the way of things with large chest cavities and dense vocal architecture. It didn't carry emotion so much as weight. You should tell your instructor you're injured. Sierra looked at him with mild interest. I'm not injured. You will be. He said it without particular malice. Informational. A weather forecast. This is not a matched assessment. You are not at my level. The instructor made an error, or he is making a point. Either way, the outcome is the same. What outcome is that? Krath's eyes, 3 of them, wide and flat and a pale mineral gray, moved across her in a single dismissive pass. You leave in a medical unit. Your species is removed from combat track consideration. The Academy's records show another data point confirming what every evaluation already shows. He paused. Humans have no place in combat roles. The observation tiers had gone quiet in that particular way that meant everyone was listening. Sira nodded slowly. That's a lot of certainty. It is fact. Fact, she repeated thoughtfully. You've fought humans before? I have reviewed human physiological data. That's not the same thing. Krath's structure shifted slightly, a Drevian micro-expression she'd catalogued as mild irritation. The data is sufficient. Sure, Sira said, and looked away from him toward the assessment floor. Already reading the surface, the angles, the distance between perimeter markers, the position of the force field projectors, cataloging, calculating, doing. In the 30 seconds before the assessment began, the kind of spatial and tactical pre-planning that she'd learned to compress into near-automatic process over years of doing it in situations where 30 seconds was all she got. Commander Hevrak's voice came from the podium. Pairs, acknowledge readiness. The other pairs called their readiness in sequence. Sira and Krath were last. Ready, Krath said. The word landed like a stone. Ready, Sira said. The word landed like nothing at all. Assessment begins. Krath moved immediately. He covered the distance in 4 strides that shook the floor. One arm swinging in a horizontal arc that would have taken her head off her shoulders if it had connected. It had the speed of something that had done this 10,000 times, and found that speed and mass, comb, in net insufficient quantity, made most other considerations irrelevant. Sira was not there. She had moved left and back. Inside a half second, letting the arc pass close enough that she felt the air displacement against her face. She kept moving, circling, creating distance, resetting her position. No counterattack. No dramatic dodge. Just absence. Krath reset. Tractor came again. Another combination. High strike, body blow, leg sweep in sequence. Technical, practiced, built from 17 months of successful repetition. Sira went under the high strike. Absorbed the body blow on her forearm rather than her torso, redistributing the impact. Managing the force, and skipped back from the leg sweep. She was breathing evenly. Her expression was the focused, quiet attention of someone doing a job. The observation tier started, making sounds, commentary, some laughter. She was running. The human was just running. Any second now, Sira wasn't running. She was reading. Every attack was data. Every movement was information. The precise angle of his shoulder before he committed to a right strike. The way his lead foot planted fractionally early when he was transitioning to a low attack. The 3-beat rhythm his combinations always resolved to aggressive. Aggressive, consolidate, a pattern. So deeply trained into his structure that he probably didn't know it was there. He had 17 months of perfect victories written into his muscle memory. She had 90 seconds of very careful observation. She needed about 3 more minutes. She let him chase her. Crowds settled into a kind of expectant patience. This would end soon. The human was surviving on movement alone, and movement ran out. It always ran out. Krath's 4th combination came harder than the first 3, more committed, more aggressive, the first sign that he was moving from demonstration to conclusion. He wanted this finished. He was beginning to find the evasion mildly irritating. The way a much larger creature finds a very fast, very small one, not dangerous. Just annoying. That was the second crack. Sira filed it away and kept moving. 2 minutes in. The crowd was getting restless. Sira was smiling. Not visibly, she knew better than that. But internally, in the place where she kept the part of herself that the file didn't describe. She was smiling. There you are, she thought. Watching the pattern resolve for the 4th time with perfect precision. There's everything I need. She stopped retreating. She stood still in the center of the assessment floor. Feet shoulder width apart, hands loose, and looked at Krath with an expression of complete, settled calm. He slowed for just a fraction of a second. reading the change, uncertain of it. Then he decided it didn't matter, and came at her with everything, the moment Kraft committed fully to his charge. Sierra understood something that she suspected he had never once been forced to learn. The most dangerous thing about strength is how completely it can lie to you. Strength says this works. This always works. This will always work. Strength accumulates evidence over years of unchallenged success and builds from that. Evidence an architecture of certainty so solid that by the time something threatens it, you cannot process the information quickly enough to adapt. Kraft had never needed to adapt. That was his entire vulnerability. It was, unfortunately for him, also the only vulnerability she needed. She moved into him rather than away. It was a counterintuitive choice that would have looked suicidal to anyone in the observation tier who was watching with the same assumptions Kraft was operating under. You don't move toward the thing that will kill you. You run, you evade. You create distance, unless you've spent the last 2 minutes identifying exactly where the equally distance hurts you and where the closeness helps. Sierra slipped inside his reaching arm as his full commitment charge arrived, turned her shoulder into the inside line of his attack, and redirected. She didn't block. She didn't have the mass to block. She used his momentum as a vector and changed the vector by 11 degrees, which was enough to send 460 pounds of Drevian warrior into a trajectory that his own feet couldn't correct for in the time available. He stumbled. 1 step, 2, catching himself. Not falling. Not even close to falling, but stumbling. The observation tier went quiet. He hadn't stumbled in 17 months. Kraft turned, and for the first time, his 3 pale eyes held something other than dismissive certainty. Not fear, not yet, but the first faint cognitive discomfort of a mind encountering data that doesn't fit its model. He recalibrated quickly. She could see it happening, his stance dropping lower, his approach adjusting. He was good. She had never doubted that. She hit him before the recalibration finished. Not a power strike. She didn't have power strikes in the relevant sense. She would need roughly 400% more mass to damage Drevian mineral composite structure with direct force impact. What she had instead was the accumulated education of 6 years learning from people who had spent their entire professional lives figuring out how to hurt things that were significantly larger than them, and the precise anatomical map of Drevian biology she'd committed to memory in the 48 hours after the assessment pairing was posted. Every species had structural logic. Biology was engineering, and engineering had tolerances. Drevian silicate iron lattice was extraordinarily strong under direct compressive force, which was the force direction that evolution had spent millions of years optimizing for, because the threats on their homeworld had mostly been very large things trying to land on them. What it was less optimized for was lateral stress at joint articulation points, where the lattice structure necessarily thinned and flexed to allow movement. You couldn't break a Drevian joint with a punch. You could, if you knew exactly where to strike and at precisely what angle, temporarily overload the nerve analog cluster that controlled the joint's proprioceptive response, which made the joint not break, not lock, but briefly and profoundly lie to the brain about where it was. The effect lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds, in a fight, was an enormous amount of time. She hit the right shoulder joint articulation point with 2 fingers, rigid at the angle she'd worked out from his attack geometry. She had practiced the motion approximately 300 times in her bunk over the past 2 days, running it until it sat in her hands as naturally as breathing. Kraft's right arm dropped 6 inches, moved laterally without his instruction, then corrected. He blinked, all 3 eyes, a Drevian involuntary stress response. That had not happened before. He did not know what had just happened. She was already moving to his left knee. Same principle, different cluster, applied at the load-bearing moment of his weight transfer. His left leg shuffled sideways one step. He caught himself again, but the weight transfer completed wrong, and his center of gravity lurched left before he rebalanced. 2 seconds. She was already at his right flank. The observation tier had gone from noise to complete, total silence. The quality of that silence was specific. It was the silence of 3,000 people watching something that wasn't supposed to be possible and trying to reorganize their understanding around it in real time. Krath swung at her. She wasn't there. He swung again. She was behind him. She hit the nerve cluster at the base of his neck, the Drevian analog of the vagus nerve pathway, where the mineral composite structure thinned to allow signal transmission to the upper limbs with the heel of her palm at the angle that would send a resonant disruption upward through his lattice rather than pressing directly against it. His shoulders seized for 1.5 seconds. Both arms lost fine motor control. In that 1.5 seconds, Sira drove her knee into the back of his left leg, below the primary load joint, with every pound of her body weight leveraged behind it at the precise mechanical angle to buckle the joint without requiring more force than she possessed. 460 pounds came down, not stumbling this time, not catching himself. Down, one knee on the assessment floor, a sound like a boulder settling. A vibration that everyone in the observation tier felt through their seats. Krath was on one knee. The silence in the observation tier changed character entirely. He came back up fast. That was the honest truth. And Sira didn't underestimate it. He was back on his feet inside 2 seconds, and his adaptation response was better than she'd expected. His stance completely reformed. His approach geometry changed. He was learning in real time, the way competent fighters learned when something didn't work, rapidly and with anger. But anger channeled rather than wasted. She respected that. She also used it. Anger channeled meant commitment. Commitment meant prediction. She had watched him adapt, and adapting had its own pattern. He was moving to pressure tactics now, trying to crowd her, remove the space she was using to target his joint clusters. It was smart. It was the right call. It was also, given what she'd been setting up for the last 4 minutes, exactly what she needed him to do. She let him crowd her. She gave ground, let him think the pressure was working, let the angle close between them until she was well inside the effective range of any strike he could throw. At that range, mass and reach meant nothing. At that range, combat devolved to pure leverage and positional control, which was the domain she had spent more of her life in than almost any other. Her left arm threaded inside his right, locking the arm outward. Her right hand found the specific stress concentration point at the junction of his neck lattice.